The morning Henrietta Grayson turned 33, she did not cry, did not linger in front of the small cracked mirror above her wash basin, and did not accept a single well-meaning comment from the women of Caldwell, Kansas, who still felt it necessary to remind her that time was not standing still on her behalf. She pulled on her boots, pinned her dark hair back with the 2 tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her, and walked out into the dry September heat of 1883 to open her shop the same way she had done every morning for the past 4 years, because the shop did not care about her age, and neither did she, at least. That was what she told herself. Henrietta owned and operated the only millinery and dry goods establishment on the south side of Caldwell's main avenue, a narrow building wedged between a saddle maker and a telegraph office, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read simply Grayson's. It was not a grand enterprise, but it was hers, paid for with money she had saved during 3 years of teaching school before the consumption took her mother and left her the small inheritance that made the shop possible. She had built something. She had built it alone, and she was proud of it with the quiet, unshowy pride of a woman who has learned not to expect applause. The town of Caldwell sat close to the Kansas-Indian Territory border, which meant it was a rougher sort of place than most, full of cattle drovers and cattle buyers, gamblers, whiskey merchants, and the peculiar mixture of desperate ambition and desperate exhaustion that defined the cattle trade. The Kishom Trail had been declining for a few years as the railroads pushed further south and the Kansas quarantine laws tightened, but Caldwell still had life in it, still had noise and commerce, and the particular energy of a town that had not yet decided if it was going to become respectable or not. Henrietta had become part of the fabric of it. She knew everyone's name, supplied the wives of ranchers with ribbon and dress goods, sold flour and salt and lamp oil to the homesteaders who came in from the surrounding grasslands, and she did all of this with a competence and directness that people had learned to depend on. She was liked. She was respected. She was, in the careful language of the women who meant well and caused damage anyway, a fine woman who really ought to have found someone by now. She had heard every variation. She knew each one by heart the way a person knows the words to a hymn they have sung too many times. You are still young enough, Henrietta. There must be a good man somewhere. Do not be too particular. Do not be too proud. The schoolteacher who had courted her 2 years ago had been kind but deeply boring, a man whose conversation never wandered beyond the boundaries of what was already known and agreed upon. The cattle broker who had expressed interest last spring had been charming in a slick, pressuring way that made her skin feel wrong, like wearing a coat in August. She had said no to both of them with clear, polite firmness, and the town had interpreted her refusals as tragedy rather than preference. She had stopped correcting that interpretation. It was simpler to let people believe she was simply unlucky than to explain that she was, in fact, waiting for something specific, not wealth, not security exactly, though security mattered practically, but a feeling of rightness, a sense that the person across from her was genuinely there, genuinely present, genuinely interested in her rather than in the idea of a wife to fill a house. She had not found that yet. She had made peace with the possibility that she might not. Bernard Bristol arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of September 1883, which happened to be 3 weeks after Henrietta's birthday, and he arrived the way most men of his particular kind arrived, on horseback, dusty, looking like he had covered a significant distance, and was not entirely certain what he was doing here now that he had covered it. He was 37, though he did not volunteer this information to anyone. He had a lean, weathered quality about him, the kind that comes not from hardship alone, but from years spent outdoors under wide skies, a man shaped by open country. His hat was good quality but old, his coat was well cut and worn through at one elbow, and his dark beard was trimmed close in the manner of a man who kept himself tidy, but had no one at home requiring it of him. He had been a cattleman. He had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail twice. in 1876 and again in 1878, before he used his earnings to buy a small property in Texas near the Red River, where he had attempted to run a breeding operation with moderate success for several years. Then the drought of 1882 had come, and it had been thorough and unforgiving in the way that droughts in Texas often are, and by the spring of 1883 he had made the difficult decision to sell what was left of his herd, square his debts honestly, and start again somewhere. He was not a man who talked much about his feelings. He had been told once by a woman he had briefly loved in the late 1870s that he was too closed, too self-contained, too much like a window that had been painted shut. He had thought about that observation for a long time afterward and had concluded that she was probably right, and that he was not entirely sure what to do about it. He had tried to be more open. He was not certain he had succeeded. He had no family of note to return to. His parents had died within a year of each other when he was in his mid-20s, a father who had drunk himself down gradually, and a mother who had simply worn out from years of managing what his father would not. He had a sister in Missouri who wrote him letters twice a year, and whose letters he answered with the dutiful brevity of a man who is not unkind, but is not, by nature, a correspondent. He had arrived in Caldwell because he had heard from a man in Wichita that land could still be had reasonably here, near the territory border, and that the town had a future in it, yet despite the cattle trade slowing. He was not sure he believed this entirely, but he needed somewhere to go, and the direction was as good as any other. On his second morning in town, he needed supplies. He had taken a room at the Leland Hotel, which was a generous name for what was essentially a clean but plain boarding house, and the clerk there had told him that Grayson's on the South Avenue was where people generally went for dry goods, that it was well stocked and honest in its pricing. Bernard tied his horse at the post outside and ducked through the low doorway into the cool interior of the shop. The bell above the door announced him. The woman behind the counter looked up from the ledger she was writing in, and the first thing Bernard noticed was not her face, but the steadiness of her gaze, the kind of unhurried, assessing look that belongs to someone who has learned to form their own opinions quickly and has not been wrong often enough to stop trusting them. "Morning," she said. "What do you need?" "Coffee, salt, a length of rope if you have it, and if you carry boot oil I would appreciate a tin of that," he said. "I carry all of those," she said, and closed her ledger with the unhurried efficiency of a person who knows exactly where everything is. "You just come in." "Yesterday," he said. "Bernard Bristol." "Henrietta Grayson," she said, already moving toward the shelf behind her. "I heard you took a room at the Leland. Pete Marsh, the hotel clerk, tells everyone's business inside of 20 minutes. It is a small town." "I figured," Bernard said. He watched her gather his items with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this same set of movements thousands of times and had not yet become careless about it. "Is it the kind of small town that minds a man's business or just knows it?" She set the coffee tin on the counter and glanced at him with something that might have been the beginning of amusement. "Both, usually, though it minds it more if you give it something interesting to mind. So far all Pete had was that you came in alone, your horse is a bay gelding, and you paid for 2 nights up front." "That is not very interesting," Bernard said. "No," Henrietta agreed. "Which is why nobody is minding your business yet. Come back with a woman or a scandal and that will change quickly." He almost smiled at that. She turned to the shelf for the salt, and he looked around the shop properly. The orderly rows of fabric bolts in one section, the tools and hardware in another, the dry goods arranged with clear logic, a small display of ribbons and trim near the window that caught the morning light. It was a well-managed place. Whoever ran it knew what they were doing. "You own this?" he asked. "I do," she said, with a flatness in her voice that told him the question had a history of annoying her, likely because people expected the answer to be no. "It is a good shop," he said simply, and meant it without embellishment. She set the salt beside the coffee and looked at him again, this time with the slight upward shift of someone recalibrating. "Thank you," she said, and this time there was nothing defensive in it. "The rope is in the back, hemp or jute." "Hemp," he said. She went to the back, and he heard her moving things, the quiet, competent sounds of someone entirely at home in their space. He waited without fidgeting, which was something most people found difficult in the silence of an unfamiliar place. He had never had trouble with silence. He had sometimes had trouble with breaking it. She came back with the rope coiled neatly over her arm, found the boot oil on a lower shelf, and laid everything out. She wrote the total in pencil on a slip of paper and turned it toward him without announcing the number, the way a person does when they trust you can read. He counted out exact change and passed it across the counter. Their hands did not touch. He picked up his purchases and nodded, and she was already back to her ledger before the bell above the door announced his departure. He thought about her vaguely, the way you think about a well-made piece of work, with appreciation and without urgency, as he walked back toward the hotel. He did not think he was in any condition to be thinking about a woman. He had too many practical matters requiring his attention first. He needed to find land. He needed to decide what kind of operation he was going to build this time. He needed, in general, to put his life back into some kind of workable order before he could reasonably turn his attention toward anything else. These were entirely sensible conclusions, and he believed them completely. He was back in Grayson's 3 days later for a list of things he had forgotten the first time. Henrietta did not remark on this, though the corner of her mouth moved very slightly when she looked at his second list, and saw that it included items she would have expected any experienced man to have thought of immediately. She said nothing because she had no interest in making him feel foolish, only in filling his order, which she did with the same swift, quiet efficiency as before. He was in the shop again 4 days after that. This time he did not have a list. He said he needed to look at what fabrics she carried, because he was hoping to find something suitable for curtains, that the room he was renting had a window that faced east, and he was not sleeping well because of it. She showed him what she had: a practical dark cotton that would block the light, a heavier wool that would do the job even better through winter, and he stood beside her at the fabric table, and they discussed the merits of each option with a thoroughness that was really not necessary for the purpose of buying curtain fabric. She cut what he needed. He rolled it under his arm. At the door he paused and turned back. "Is there somewhere in this town a man can eat a decent meal that is not the Lellens' dining room?" he asked. "No offense to the Lellen, but they have cooked the same pot of beef 3 days running, and I believe it is getting worse each time." "Clara Marsh's place," Henrietta said. 2 streets east, white door. She is Pete Marsh's wife, which is its own kind of thing, but she is an excellent cook. She does a midday dinner and an evening supper, and both are worth the 30 cents. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. And then, because she was already behind the counter again and he was already at the door, she added, in the tone of a person who has not planned to say something but has said it before thinking it over, "She does not open on Wednesdays. If you want a decent meal tomorrow, you will need to cook it yourself or go to the hotel." He looked at her across the length of the shop. "I am not a poor cook," he said. "If someone were to sell me the ingredients, I suppose I could do that," she said. And that, both of them would agree later, looking back at it, was when something shifted, though neither of them would have been able to pinpoint the exact nature of the shift. It was less like a door opening and more like noticing for the first time that a door was there. He bought the ingredients. He cooked his own supper in the small kitchen of a widower named James Pratt, who rented him the use of the stove in exchange for half the meal and the company, because Bernard had mentioned to Pete Marsh that he needed access to a proper kitchen, and Pete had mentioned it to James, and that was how things worked in a town like Caldwell. Bernard sat across the table from the 60-year-old widower and ate a reasonable beef stew with biscuits and thought, for the first time since leaving Texas, that he might actually be able to make something work here. He started asking around about available land that same week. There was a parcel of 320 acres about 8 miles northeast of town, owned by a man named Elihu Cass, who had taken it under the Homestead Act in 1875, but had never truly committed to farming it and was now, in his 60s and increasingly rheumatic, willing to sell at a price that was fair if not generous. Bernard rode out to look at it on a Friday, with Elihu's neighbor serving as a guide, and he walked the property in the long afternoon light and felt the particular quiet settling in his chest that comes to a person who has spent their life outdoors and who has just recognized a piece of land they could care for. It was grassland mostly, with a creek running through the eastern portion that had not dried up during the recent drought years, a significant advantage. The existing structures were modest: a house that needed considerable work but had solid bones, a barn that was in better shape than the house, and a small bunkhouse that would be serviceable. The grass was the real value. Good grazing, sheltered from the north by a long natural ridge. He could run cattle here. Not a grand operation to start, but a real one. He sent a letter to Elihu Cass that evening and began the process of negotiation. While this was happening, he continued to visit Grayson's. He would have said, if pressed, that he went because he needed things, which was true in the practical sense. But the truth underneath the practical truth was that he had found that the time he spent in that shop, talking to Henrietta Grayson about whatever small or large topic arose between them, was the clearest-headed he felt during the day. She spoke plainly. She had opinions, and she stated them without apology and without aggression. She was funny in a dry, understated way that caught him off guard and delighted him. She did not fill silence with noise just to fill it, which meant that, when she spoke, he paid attention. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learn about a landscape by traveling through it slowly rather than by looking at it on a map. He learned that she had grown up in this part of Kansas, that her father had been a farmer who died when she was 19, that she had taught school for 3 years after her father's death, and opened the shop 4 years ago at 29 after her mother's passing. He learned that she read everything she could get her hands on, that she ordered books from a supplier in Kansas City whenever she could afford to, and that she had strong and interesting views on most of the books she had read. He learned that she had a small house behind the shop, that she kept a kitchen garden which was now going dormant for winter, and that she had a gray cat named Marshall who had come with the property when she bought it, and who considered her arrival a satisfactory arrangement. He learned that she was 33 and that the town had a great deal to say about this fact, and that she had, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has examined her circumstances and made her choices, stopped listening to what the town had to say. He told her, in return, about Texas, about the drought and the hard decision to sell, about the cattle he had lost, about the land he was hoping to buy from Elihu Cass. He told her these things plainly, without the performance of stoicism that he might have used with other people, because something about the way she listened made performances feel unnecessary and slightly embarrassing. She listened to the story of his losses with the attentiveness of someone who understood what it meant to lose things and to go on anyway, and she did not offer empty reassurance or cheerful predictions. She simply said, after a pause, 8 miles northeast is good land. The creek there does not run dry. I have heard that from the Danforth family who homesteaded 2 miles east of that parcel 15 years ago and are still there. He looked at her. How do you know about that piece of land? People come into this shop, she said. They talk. I pay attention. He smiled at that. It was a real smile, not a polite one, and she saw it and looked at the counter in the way that a person does when they are not entirely indifferent to a thing and would prefer not to be caught being moved by it. The negotiation with Elihu Cass was completed in the 3rd week of October. Bernard paid what was agreed, signed what needed signing, and became the owner of 320 acres of Kansas grassland with a house that needed work and a barn that was ready for livestock. He threw himself into the work of the property with the single-minded energy of a man who has too many feelings to examine and has learned to convert them into physical labor. He rode out every morning at first light, worked until dark, and rode back to the Leland to eat whatever was available and sleep. He was making a list of every repair the house required. He was making another list of livestock he needed and what he could afford to buy first. He was, in the careful and practical way of a man who has been burned before, trying to build something that could not be taken from him by drought or bad luck or his own insufficiency. He came into town on Saturdays for supplies and for conversation, and the conversation increasingly happened at Grayson's. It was on a Saturday in late October, when the air had taken on its first real bite, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone entirely golden, that the conversation between Bernard Bristol and Henrietta Grayson made its first move past the practical and into something else. He had come in for coffee and lamp oil. He had mentioned, by way of making conversation, that he was trying to decide on the layout of the kitchen renovation, and was finding it harder than he had expected because he was working from the outside in and had not thought clearly enough about the interior from the beginning. She said, without looking up from what she was doing, "I could come and look at it if you wanted a second opinion. I am good at spatial things." The offer surprised them both. He knew it had surprised her because of the slight pause that followed it, the pause of a woman who has said something she had not planned to say and is deciding whether to retract it. He did not let her retract it. "I would appreciate that," he said, genuinely. She came on a Sunday, which was the one day Grayson's was closed, riding out on a sensible brown mare she kept at the livery. He met her at the edge of the property and they rode in together, and he showed her the house, and she walked every room of it with the focused, unhurried attention she gave to everything, asking practical questions about what he intended to do with each space, not decorative questions but structural and functional ones. Where did he want the water from the pump to reach? What would be the coldest room in winter, and what could be done about it? Which walls could be taken down without compromising anything load-bearing? She knew about these things. It turned out her mother had been a capable woman who had taught her daughter that understanding how a building worked was as necessary as understanding how a kitchen worked. Henrietta had helped her mother manage their farmhouse after her father's death and had learned the language of practical building in the process. Bernard listened to her with the same close attention he gave to people who actually knew what they were talking about, which was a form of respect he had been told he was not always good at offering, and which he was trying to be more conscious of. He did not dismiss her suggestions or qualify them. He wrote some of them down in the small notebook he carried in his coat pocket. When they were done with the house, they stood in the dooryard in the cool October air and looked out at the land. The grass had gone to its autumn gold brown, and the ridge to the north was a long dark line against the pale sky. It was quiet in the particular complete way that open country becomes quiet in late autumn, when the bird migrations are finished and the insects are gone, and there is only the wind. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I thought so when I first walked it. It is different to think it and to know you are going to be here. The knowing takes a while to set." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is true of most things that matter." He looked at her. She was looking at the ridge, her hat brim catching the light, her profile still and serious in the way that her face became when she was thinking something she was not yet sure she was going to say. "What are you going to name it?" she asked. He had not thought about a name. He had been so focused on the practical that the naming of it had not occurred to him, which struck him now as an oversight. "I do not know," he said honestly. "You should name it something," she said. "A place without a name is just geography." He thought about this for a long moment. "What would you call it?" "That is not my question to answer," she said, and there was something in the way she said it careful, almost deliberate. That suggested she understood perfectly well that naming a piece of land was a claim of belonging, and that she was being precise about the limits of her claim. He named it Bristol Creek, eventually, for the water that ran through its eastern edge, and because he wanted the name to be simple and honest. He told her this the following Saturday when he came in for supplies, and she looked up from her counter and said, "That suits it," and he felt unreasonably pleased. November arrived with cold nights and shortened days, and Bernard was spending most of his time at the property, sleeping some nights in the barn when the work ran too late to make the ride back to town sensible, wrapping himself in blankets against the frost while the horses shifted in their stalls below him. He had bought 2 draft horses and 4 cows, a reasonable start, and he had hired a young man of 20 named Theo Aldridge from a family farming 3 miles north, whose honesty and willingness to learn outweighed his inexperience by enough to make the arrangement worthwhile. The house was coming together. A carpenter from town named Harlow Bates was helping with the major structural work, and Bernard was doing the rest himself in the evenings. He had followed Henrietta's recommendations on the kitchen layout and was gratified to find, as the work progressed, that she had been right about every practical detail. He thought about her a great deal. He was aware that thinking about her was becoming not a background occurrence but a foreground one, which he found both unsurprising and slightly alarming, because he was not the kind of man who arrived at feelings quickly, and the speed at which this particular set of feelings was arriving suggested something significant was happening that he had not, perhaps, been paying sufficient attention to. He was not sure what to do about it. He was aware that his previous experience with romantic relationships had not been, on the whole, a success story. The woman in the 1870s who had said he was like a painted-shut window had married a livery owner in Abilene and was, by all accounts, perfectly content. There had been a brief and mutually uncomfortable courtship in his late 20s with a woman whose father had made it abundantly clear he did not consider Bernard Bristol a satisfactory candidate. There had been, in the years since, a general withdrawal from the whole enterprise, not from bitterness, but from a practical assessment that he was better suited to building things than to the particular vulnerability that came with caring about another person. He was 37. He had stopped, somewhere in his mid-30s, counting the years that other people seemed to feel he ought to have been married by. He had stopped keeping track of the age at which a man was supposed to have a wife and a family and a settled life. He had simply stopped counting and had continued working, and had told himself that this was fine. He was beginning to suspect, standing in the barn on a cold November night with the horses breathing warm steam into the frost and a lantern making a small circle of light in the dark, that what he had told himself was not entirely the full truth. He came into town the next Saturday with a specific purpose, alongside the supply run. He found Henrietta behind her counter in conversation with a customer, one of the Danforth women he had heard mentioned, a tall, capable-looking woman in her 40s who was ordering a length of dark blue wool. He waited, looking at the display of ribbons near the window, turning his hat in his hands in the way that a man does when he is rehearsing something. The Danforth woman departed. The shop was empty except for the 2 of them. "I was wondering," he said, without any preamble because preamble made him uncomfortable, "whether you might want to have supper with me." "Not at Clara Marsh's place. I was thinking somewhere with a bit more privacy, if there is such a thing in this town, because I would like to have a conversation with you that is not being overheard by Pete Marsh or anyone he reports to." Henrietta was looking at him steadily. She had a particular quality of stillness when she was listening to something important, a gathering of attention that he recognized as the opposite of dismissal. She let the whole thing land before she responded. "The back room of my shop has a stove and a table," she said. "It is private. If you bring the food, I will provide the space and the good coffee." "That works," he said. "Saturday evening," she said. "After 6, when the light is gone and the avenue is quiet." "I will be here," he said. He was there at 5 minutes to 6 with provisions from Clara Marsh, who had agreed to put together a cold supper for him without asking too many questions, though her eyes had been expressive on the subject. He knocked at the shop's side door, which Henrietta had told him led directly to the back room. She opened it in a plain dark dress with her hair down, which startled him because he had only ever seen her in her working clothes with her hair pinned. And the difference was significant not because she looked different, particularly, but because she looked more like herself, the self that existed without the arrangement of public presentation. The back room was small and warm, with a cast iron stove giving off good heat, and a table set with 2 plain cups and a cloth, and the gray cat named Marshall occupying the chair nearest the stove with an air of permanent entitlement. Bernard set his provisions on the table and Henrietta made the coffee, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and for the first several minutes they talked about the weather and the property and the progress on the house, because they were both people who approached the important things by circling them first, and this was understood between them. Then she said, very quietly, setting down her coffee cup, "What was it you wanted to say? The thing that requires no one overhearing it." He was quiet for a moment. Marshall the cat regarded him from the adjacent chair with the unsentimental assessment that cats apply to all human endeavors. "I think," Bernard said, measuring each word the way a careful man measures flour, "that I am more interested in you than I have been interested in anyone in a very long time. And I am not certain that is a comfortable thing to say, and I am aware that I am probably not entirely easy to know, but I felt that it was honest and that you were a person who would prefer honesty to maneuvering." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was warm and the stove ticked quietly, and outside the wind had picked up along the avenue and was doing something low and mournful with the sign above the shop. "I would," she said, "prefer honesty." "Good," he said. "I will be honest in return then," she said. "I have been thinking about you more than is strictly explained by the fact that you are a customer who returns frequently. I have also been aware that I am at an age at which this town has largely decided my romantic future has passed, and that I do not agree with that assessment, but that I am also not in the habit of investing feeling in things that are going to come to nothing." "That is a reasonable position," he said. "So I am asking you directly," she said, "whether you are actually here because you are interested in me as a person, or whether you are here because you have bought a house and the house wants a woman in it." He felt the sharpness of the question and did not flinch from it, because she was right to ask it and he respected the asking. "That is a fair question," he said. "I will tell you honestly that both things are true in the sense that I want to build something here and I would like to build it with someone, but the someone in question is not any available woman, it is specifically you. Not because you are convenient, but because you are the most interesting person I have encountered in a very long time, and because talking to you is the part of my week I look forward to most. That is not a manufactured feeling. I am not capable of manufacturing that sort of thing even when I have tried." She was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be noticeable and short enough to not be worrying. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I think we should spend more time together," she said. "Not rushing, not with any pressure from the town or anyone else. I have been rushed before, and the rushing is what makes people end up with the wrong person. But I think we should spend more time together honestly and see what there is to see." "That is exactly what I would have asked for," he said. She smiled then, a real smile that changed her whole face, and that he realized he had been catching only partial glimpses of, and that the full version was considerably more remarkable than the partial ones. He felt something in his chest that was not comfortable exactly, but that was entirely right. They ate Clara Marsh's cold supper and they talked for 2 hours, and the conversation was the easiest and most fully engaged he could remember having with another person in years. She told him about her childhood on the farm, about her father who had been a quiet, steady man who read to his children every evening from whatever books he could find. She told him about the year's teaching school, which she had enjoyed more than she had expected because she liked children and liked the challenge of finding the way into each different mind. She told him about the decision to open the shop and the terror of the first month when she had not been certain it would work, and the slow-growing certainty as it did that she was capable of more than people had assumed. He told her things he had not told many people. He told her about his mother, who had been a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth, who had been confined by the life she had been handed, and whose intelligence had turned inward for lack of outward direction, and who he had mourned not only when she died, but at intervals throughout his life when he had encountered some injustice of that same shape. He told her about the cattle drives, which had been brutal and exhilarating in equal measure, and which he was glad to be done with. He told her about the drought with a flatness in his voice that told her, even without his saying so, that the telling of it still cost him something. She listened to all of it without filling the silences or offering the easy comfort that would have rung false. When he was done, she said, "You are a person who does not give up on things, even when the thing you are not giving up on requires starting over entirely." "I do not know what else to do," he said honestly. "Most people find other options," she said. "Resignation mostly, or blame." "Those never seemed useful," he said. "No," she agreed. "They do not in the end." He rode back to the property in the dark, which was a thing a sensible man did not do in November in Kansas because the night was cold and the horse needed to feel the ground. But he went slowly, and the bay gelding was sure-footed, and the stars were extraordinary in the clear frozen sky, and he did not mind the cold. December came. The temperature dropped seriously, and the creek at the eastern edge of the property froze over in its shallower sections, and Bernard was now sleeping at the property full-time, having moved his things from the Leland with a simplicity of transaction that Pete Marsh received with visible disappointment at losing a regular paying guest. The house was now habitable, not finished, not comfortable in any luxurious sense, but warm and functional and increasingly showing the shape of what it was going to be. He came to town twice a week now rather than once. He told himself this was because the supply runs were more frequent in winter, which was partially true. He came in on Saturdays for the long supply run and on Wednesdays, which was Clara Marsh's closed day, nominally because he needed odds and ends, in practice because Henrietta had a quieter morning on Wednesdays and they had developed a habit of talking at length over the counter while business was slow. The town noticed this, because the town noticed everything. There was conversation among the women who congregated at the dry goods counter, and conversation among the men who leaned against the building fronts in the milder part of the afternoon, and conversation at the hotel table, where the unmarried and recently widowed congregated on Sunday evenings. The general opinion was that it was about time Henrietta Grayson met someone sensible, and that Bernard Bristol seemed sensible, and that they hoped she did not do anything to talk herself out of it on account of being too particular. Henrietta was aware of these conversations. She received them with the same calm that she had developed over years of being a subject of public concern, which was to acknowledge them enough to be polite and disregard them enough to be sane. She was not talking herself out of anything. She was, in fact, talking herself into things she had not expected to feel with this degree of certainty and this degree of quiet gladness. She had not told him this yet. She was saving it, not from coyness but from the practical instinct of a woman who has built something alone and learned not to overextend before the foundation is confirmed solid. The confirmation, when it came unexpectedly on a Thursday in mid-December. She had been closing up the shop in the late afternoon when a man came in whom she did not recognize, large, with a face that had weathered into something unpleasant, wearing a coat that was too fine for the rest of him, carrying the particular air of a man who is used to not being refused things. He introduced himself as Corbett, said he was in the land business, and had heard she owned the building she was operating in, said he would like to talk to her about a purchase offer. She told him the building was not for sale. He told her she should think about it carefully because the offer was generous. She told him she had thought about it and the building was not for sale. He became, in the patient, escalating way of certain men, more and more pressuring, and when she held her position without wavering, he said several things about women running businesses alone that were intended to be diminishing, and she stood behind her counter and looked at him with the cool directness she had been practicing her whole life, and told him she would like him to leave. He was leaving slowly, with the performed reluctance of a man demonstrating that he was controlling the speed of his own departure, when the shop door opened and Bernard came in. Bernard had come because he had ridden into town to pick up a package the freight wagon had brought that morning and had planned to stop in anyway, and he saw immediately from Henrietta's face and from the departing man's demeanor that something had just happened that was not ordinary. He stepped aside to let the man pass without acknowledging him, came to the counter and looked at Henrietta. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "A man who wanted to buy my building and did not like being told no." Bernard looked toward the door the man had gone through. He turned back. "Do you want me to know?" she said firmly. "I handled it. He is gone. That is the end of it." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded, because he recognized the tone and because one of the things he had understood about her was that her autonomy was not decorative but structural, that she had built her entire life on the foundation of her own competence and did not want to have it managed around her. "All right," he said. "Good." And then, because she looked, underneath the composure, somewhat shaken in the way that a person is shaken when they have maintained composure through something that was actually frightening, and because he did not know what to do with that and defaulted to honesty, he said, "I would have said something to him. I want you to know that. Not because I think you needed it, but because I would have." She looked at him and the steadiness in her face softened, just slightly, in the way that someone's expression softens when they have been holding something and are given permission to set it down for a moment. "I know," she said. "It was a small thing. It did not resolve anything dramatic. But it was, for both of them, a moment in which something was confirmed that had been building for weeks. That this person who was standing across a counter from you was someone you could trust not to overreach and not to leave." Christmas in Caldwell in 1883 was marked by a church social, a dance at the Oddfellows Hall, and a general slowing of commerce as the cattle trade was fully dormant for winter, and the townspeople turned inward. Henrietta's shop was busy in the weeks before Christmas with people buying ribbon and fabric for gifts and children coming in with pennies for candy from the small glass jar she kept on the counter, and she was absorbed in all of this. Bernard came in on Christmas Eve with a package wrapped in brown paper which he set on the counter with a lack of ceremony that was entirely characteristic. Inside was a book, a collected volume of poems by Walt Whitman that she had mentioned in passing 3 weeks ago that she had tried to find and been unable to locate. She looked at the book and then looked up at him, and her face did something complicated and quiet. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City," he said. "It took a while." She held the book for a moment. She had received gifts before. She had not often received one that required 3 weeks of secretive effort. "Thank you," she said, and the 2 words carried everything she was not yet saying aloud. She had something for him, too, a pair of heavy wool gloves she had made herself, knitted in the evenings over the past month. She had told herself it was a practical gift, which was true, and that there was nothing particular about the making of it, which was not true. He put them on his hands and flexed his fingers and looked at the workmanship with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that a thing made well represents more than the thing itself. "These will last," he said. "They will," she confirmed. They went to the Christmas dance that evening at the Oddfellows Hall, not formally together in the way of an announced couple, but in the way of 2 people who arrived at the same time, and who did not leave each other's company for the length of the evening, and who danced twice, which in the accounting of Caldwell, Kansas in 1883 was not so many dances that it made a declaration, but enough dances that it constituted a statement. He was not, it emerged, a graceful dancer, but he was a willing one who paid attention and did not step on her feet more than twice, and she was a good dancer who led gently enough that he could follow without knowing he was following. They moved around the floor in the lamplight and the fiddle music and the warmth of the crowd, and she felt, with a clarity that she had not been expecting, that this was a thing she wanted to keep. Not just the dancing, but the person. This particular, weathered, quietly determined person who had come from Texas with a loss behind him and a future ahead of him, and had walked into her shop on a Tuesday morning and asked for rope. The new year of 1884 came in with a blizzard that pinned the town down for 4 days, and cleared to reveal a landscape so comprehensively white that people stood on their front steps and blinked at it as though the scale of it required getting used to. Bernard was at the property through the blizzard, riding it out in the house he had worked so hard to make solid, and he found that the house held up beautifully. The new window insulation kept the worst of the cold out, the stove worked exactly as it should, and young Theo Aldridge, who had been staying in the bunkhouse through the winter, came over to the main house on the second day of the blizzard, and they played cards until it cleared. He thought about Henrietta all 4 days, which he had not planned on doing, and which confirmed things he had already known, but had not yet articulated to himself fully. He thought about the competence of her and the directness of her and the way her face changed when she was about to say something sharp and amusing, and had not quite decided to say it yet. He thought about the book he had given her, and the gloves she had made him, and the dance at the Oddfellows' Hall, and the evening in the back room with the gray cat, and the cold supper, and the conversation that had made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he was not particularly isolated. He was 37, and he had stopped counting the years that other people thought he should have settled by, just as she had stopped counting the years they thought she should have married. They had both stopped counting, and in the stopping had perhaps made room for the thing to arrive in its actual form, rather than the form that the counting expected. He came into town as soon as the roads were passable, and the first place he went was Grayson's. She looked up when the bell rang, and the expression on her face when she saw it was him, quick, genuine, immediately contained, told him everything he needed to know about whether the feeling was mutual. "The house held up," he said, coming to the counter. "I thought it would," she said. "You built it right." "You helped with the kitchen," he said. "I consulted," she said. "You built it." He stood at the counter for a moment, and then he said, with the directness that she had told him she preferred, "I would like to take you to see the house properly, not as a consultant. I would like to show you what it has become, and I would like to have a proper conversation about things." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind," he said, "that I think we have both been building toward for 3 months. She was quiet for the length of a breath. "Sunday," she said. "I will ride out Sunday morning," he nodded. Sunday came clear and cold and brilliant, the land still carrying its deep snow cover, but the sky in absolute blue above it. And Henrietta rode out on her brown mare in her good coat with her hair pinned under her wide-brimmed hat, and the Whitman book in her saddlebag, because she had finished it and wanted to tell him about it. She arrived at Bristol Creek property as the morning light was still long and golden across the snow. He was waiting in the dooryard, and he had, she noticed with something warm moving through her, cleared the path from the gate to the door meticulously, and there was smoke coming from the chimney, and the whole property had a quality of preparation about it that touched her. He showed her the house. It was remarkable, truly, what he had done with it. The kitchen was exactly as she had suggested it should be and was already clearly functional. The main room was large and warm with good light from the east windows. The bedrooms were simple and plain and solid. He had not made it fancy. He had made it right, and right was considerably better than fancy. They ate the dinner he had prepared at the kitchen table, a proper hot meal of roasted chicken and root vegetables, cooked with the confidence of a man who does not need to perform domesticity, but is genuinely capable of it, and talked about the book and the property and the coming spring and what he planned for the first grazing season. And then, after the dishes were set aside and they were both sitting with coffee at the table, he looked at her with the settled, careful expression of a person who has thought about something at length and is now ready to say it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Not because the house needs someone in it, though it will be better with someone in it. Not because the town expects it, because neither of us has cared much about that. I want to ask you because I am in love with you, which I have been for some weeks now, and because I think we are well matched in the ways that matter for a long life together, and because I would rather be honest about that than spend any more time being careful around the edge of it. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was warm and the sun was coming through the east windows at a low winter angle, and the gray cat was not there, being at the shop, which was its own kingdom, and the only sounds were the settling of the stove and the distant muffled sound of wind against snow. "You are not an easy man to know," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know that. But you are worth knowing," she said, "which is the more important part." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is," she said. "It is a yes, Bernard." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they sat like that in the winter kitchen of the house he had built with her advice running through the walls of it. And it was not dramatic in the way that proposals in stories are often made dramatic, but it was entirely real and entirely true, and that was, Henrietta thought, considerably better. They were married in April of 1884. In the small white church on the north end of Caldwell's main avenue, on a day when the wildflowers were beginning to show along the creek banks, and the air had that particular tender quality that early spring carries before summer makes it serious. The ceremony was simple and short because both of them preferred simplicity and brevity to performance. Henrietta wore her best dress, a deep green that she had made herself over the winter from the finest wool she carried in the shop. Bernard wore a new coat that he had had made by the tailor in town, and which fit him properly, which was a thing his previous coat had not managed. The witnesses were Clara Marsh and young Theo Aldridge, who was embarrassed and proud in equal measure at being asked. The minister read what needed to be read, and they said what needed to be said. And when Bernard kissed her, the church contained the kind of quiet that comes when the people present are genuinely moved and are not pretending. Pete Marsh was there, and the Danforths, and Harlow Bates the carpenter, and a good number of the women who had been telling Henrietta for years that she ought to find someone, and these women were now entirely satisfied with themselves as though they had arranged the whole thing, which Henrietta found both irritating and, in the end, too minor to bother being irritated about. She kept the shop. This was not up for discussion, because she had not raised it as a discussion, only as a fact, and Bernard had treated it as a fact from the beginning. He came to town twice a week. She rode out to the property on her days off. They were not joined at the hip, and they did not need to be. They were two capable people who had built capable lives and who were now choosing to build something together, and the something they were building had room in it for both of their individual lives to continue. He was not easy to live with, in the sense that he was quiet in ways that required getting used to, and had strong opinions about small domestic matters that surprised her. She was not easy to live with in the sense that she had 4 years of living alone that had calcified into specific ways of organizing and managing things that she did not immediately want to change. There were adjustments. There were some days that required patience and some evenings that were cooler than they should have been. But the adjustments were made with the underlying goodwill of two people who were not at war with each other, and the cool evenings were always resolved before sleep, because they had both, without discussing it formally, decided that unresolved anger left overnight was not a thing they were willing to do to each other. She told him when he frustrated her. He was not always sure what to do with that, having grown up in a house where feelings were managed rather than expressed, but he was learning, and the learning was visible, which was what she cared about. He told her when he was worried, which was harder for him, and which she received with the careful, non-reactive attention of someone who understands that a man telling you he is worried is not asking you to solve the worry but to witness it. The first spring at Bristol Creek was hard in the way that first springs always are. The ground recovering from winter was unpredictable. The cattle required constant management, and there were 3 weeks in April when the rain simply refused to come, and he stood at the window of their kitchen in the early mornings and watched the sky with the tightness across his shoulders that she recognized from the way he had talked about Texas and the drought. She stood beside him one such morning and put her hand flat against the middle of his back, not saying anything, just placing her hand there, and felt the tightness in him ease by small degrees under her palm. He covered her hand with his without turning around. The rain came in the second week of May, a good soaking rain that went on for 2 days, and when it was done the grass came in strong and green across the pasture land, and his shoulders came down from around his ears, and he laughed at dinner that evening at something she said, a real open laugh that she had been collecting instances of because each one felt like something given freely. Theo Aldridge proved to be a genuinely good hand. He had a natural sense for cattle and a work ethic that meant Bernard could trust him with the property on the days he accompanied Henrietta into town, and the property on those days ran exactly as it should. Bernard was fair with his wages, a thing Theo noticed and did not take for granted, and the working relationship between them was easy and honest. By the summer of 1884, Bristol Creek had a small but solid herd of 20 cattle with several calves expected before the year's end. Bernard had found, through a contact from his old cattle driving days now working the border area, a buyer for the first batch of yearlings at a fair price, and the first real income from the property was coming in on a schedule that let him breathe. He was not wealthy. They were not wealthy. But the numbers were adding up in the right direction, and the land was proving itself, and the house was properly a home by this point, with her presence in it making every room finally feel inhabited rather than just occupied. Graysons continued to thrive. In the summer of 1884, Henrietta took on a part-time assistant, a girl of 17 named Dottie Pierce, whose family had recently homesteaded 6 miles west and who was sharp and quick to learn. Having Dottie meant Henrietta could be at the shop less than daily without the place suffering, which gave her more freedom to be at the property in the late afternoons, which she found she wanted. She had started a kitchen garden at Bristol Creek to match the one she still kept going behind the shop. It was larger than the one at the shop, with room for the things that needed more space: pumpkins, winter squash, the long rows of beans that would be dried for the cold months. She worked it in the mornings when the light was good and Bernard was working with the cattle, and sometimes they overlapped at the edge of the garden and the pasture fence, passing comments back and forth without making a ceremony of the closeness. She loved him, she knew, in the way you come to love someone when you have seen them at their best and at their worst, and have found that both the best and the worst are things you can hold without being damaged by them. She loved the way he applied himself to problems with a slow, thorough intelligence that never confused thoroughness with stubbornness, because he was willing to change direction when the evidence required it. She loved his quietness, which she had learned to read with some fluency, and which was not absence but presence of a different kind. She loved the fact that he read. She had not known this about him initially, but she had found, moving his things into the house, a collection of worn books that spoke to a man who thought about things outside the boundaries of what was immediately practical. He loved her with the same comprehensive, unshowy devotion that he applied to everything he considered worth his time and attention. He loved that she was not afraid of him, not in any subtle social way, not even in the moments when he was frustrated and sharp-edged, because she had her own edges and used them honestly and so understood his. He loved her competence and her directness and the dry, precise humor that she deployed without warning. He loved the fact that she had built something out of grief and inheritance and work, and that the building of it had made her not hard but clear about what she valued and what she would not accept. In the autumn of 1884, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning before he went out, sitting across from him with her coffee, saying it plainly in the way she said everything that mattered. He set down his cup and looked at her for a moment, and his face did something she had not seen it do before, a kind of opening, a giving way of the careful management he applied to his expressions, and for a moment he looked simply like a person who is overwhelmed in the best possible way. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. He did not say anything else for a long moment, just sat with her hand between his hands in the kitchen light. "A baby," he said finally, in the tone of a person encountering something they had imagined but had not allowed themselves to fully expect. "Spring," she said. "The doctor thinks late March or April." He nodded. He was still holding her hand. "I am going to make sure everything is safe," he said. "The house, the Bernard," she said. "Yes. Everything is already safe," she said. "You built it safe. This is good news. I need you to be happy about it rather than starting a new list." He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. "I am happy about it," he said. "I am extremely happy about it. The list is part of how I express that." "I know," she said. "Make your list, but be happy first." "I am happy first," he said, and squeezed her hand, and it was the truth. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months. She was sick in the mornings for the first 12 weeks with the reliable thoroughness of a person who does things completely. But she managed it with the practical acceptance of a woman who does not see the point of drama about things that cannot be changed. She continued to work at the shop until January, when the cold and the state of her health made the ride into town too difficult to justify daily, at which point she left Dottie Pierce largely in charge, with the understanding that Dottie would send for her if anything required her specific attention. Bernard did not hover. He was attentive in the ways that were genuinely useful. He made sure the house was warm. He did the tasks that required physical effort that was beyond what she should be attempting. He made sure there was always good food available, and that the doctor in town was visited at the intervals the doctor had specified. He also did not treat her as an invalid, because she was not one, and because treating her as helpless would have been the worst possible thing he could have done for her general mood and his own continued domestic peace. He read to her in the evenings, which was something that had started when she was too sick to read herself, and had continued after she was perfectly capable of reading again, because they had both found they liked it. He read well, not performatively, but clearly, with enough attention to the text to convey its meaning without theater. They worked through the Whitman she had already read, and through 2 novels she ordered from Kansas City, and through a volume of American history that they argued about enjoyably at intervals while he was reading it. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold but not brutal, and the property came through it in good condition. Theo's bunkhouse had been improved during the fall, and the young man was settled there with the permanence of someone who had found a place that fit him. The cattle were healthy, and the numbers were building toward the spring with the cautious optimism that Bernard had learned to maintain, always cautious, because the country could take things away, but always holding the optimism, because without it you stopped working toward things that mattered. Their son was born in the first week of April 1885, on a clear spring morning that came in with birdsong along the creek and the smell of new grass through the bedroom window. The doctor from Caldwell, a steady woman named Dr. Frances Aldrich, who had set up practice in the town 2 years before, and whose presence Henrietta had been grateful for on multiple occasions, was there through the whole of it. It was not fast and it was not easy, but it was not, in the end, dangerous, and when it was over Henrietta lay back against the pillows, with the complete and thorough exhaustion of someone who has accomplished something requiring everything they had, and the baby in her arms was solid and loud and absolutely real. Bernard came in when the doctor nodded him through. He stood at the doorway for a moment looking at the two of them, and Henrietta looked up and saw his face, and understood that she was seeing the inside of him without any management or concealment, and that what was inside him was enormous with feeling, enormous and careful and grateful in the way of a man who knows exactly how much he has been given. He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she shifted the baby toward him, and he took the child with the careful, total attention of a man encountering something fragile and irreplaceable. And the baby looked up at him with the unfocused, searching gaze of the very newly born, and Bernard looked back with the focused, completely certain gaze of a man who already knows what this person is going to mean. "Henry," Henrietta said. "I want to call him Henry." "Henry," Bernard repeated, tasting the name. "Henry Bristol. Henry Grayson Bristol," she said. "He gets both." Bernard looked at her. He smiled, the full open smile she had been collecting since the Christmas dance. "Henry Grayson Bristol," he said. "Yes, that is right." Henry Grayson Bristol grew with the speed and determination of a child who has things to do and does not intend to waste time. He was dark-haired like his mother and had his father's steadiness, a quality you could observe even in infancy in the way he looked at things, not fretful, but evaluating. He was a contented baby in general, which both parents suspected had more to do with luck than with anything they had done, and which both parents were privately grateful for. Henrietta returned to the shop in June, bringing Henry with her in the mornings, where he slept in a wicker basket behind the counter while she worked, and was admired extensively by every woman who came in and by Dottie Pierce, who had become deeply attached to him, and who proved to be both a competent shop assistant and an excellent additional pair of hands with a baby. The shop continued to do well. Caldwell was still a busy town in 1885, though the nature of its business was shifting as the cattle trade continued its long change, fewer trail drives, more settled ranching and farming as the surrounding land filled in. New families arrived. New businesses opened. The town was evolving from its rougher incarnation into something more settled, which most people considered an improvement, even if the older residents sometimes spoke of the cattle drive days with a nostalgia that the women of the town mostly did not share. Bristol Creek was having its best year. The spring calf crop was strong, the prices for beef were holding, and Bernard had, with the care and patience that he brought to everything he was building, added a second grazing field to the operation by improving the fencing and the water access on the western portion of the property. He had also hired a second hand, an older man named Ray Delacroix, who had been a trail cook in younger years, and who turned out to be useful in ways that went far beyond the practical, because he was the kind of man who understood cattle the way other people understood weather, intuitively, bodily, without having to think about it. The summer of 1885 had a quality of abundance to it, not extravagant abundance, nothing that invited complacency, but the solid, real abundance of a season in which everything has grown well, and the work has produced its results, and the people doing the work are in the right place with the right people. Bernard and Henrietta moved through that summer with the ease of two people who have learned each other well enough to function together without friction, which did not mean without argument. They argued sometimes with the directness that both of them brought to everything, but without damage. He had learned to say what he was feeling when it mattered, which was still not natural for him and probably never would be entirely, but which he did anyway because she had shown him, over the months and years since they had known each other, that the saying of things was not a weakness but a competence, and he admired competence even when its acquisition was uncomfortable. She had learned to receive his silences without interpreting them as rejection, because she had spent enough time in his company now to understand that his silences were part of his processing, not his withdrawal. She had learned the difference between the silence that preceded something important and the silence that meant he simply did not have words right now and did not need them. And the learning had taken patience and occasional misreading that they had talked their way through each time. They were, in the honest accounting of their first year of marriage, very well suited. Not perfectly suited people exist only in stories that have not been followed long enough, but genuinely and deeply suited in the ways that make a life together not a performance of compatibility, but an actual sharing of it. In the autumn of 1885, Henrietta discovered she was expecting again. She told Bernard in the same kitchen, at the same table with the same morning coffee, and this time he did not have to be told to be happy first. The happiness was on his face before she had finished the sentence. "When?" he asked. "Spring again," she said. "Perhaps May this time." "Henry will be a year old," he said, doing the arithmetic. "He will be 13 months," she said. "He will be unimpressed." "He will adapt," Bernard said. "He is a Bristol." "He is a Grayson Bristol," she reminded him. "Grayson Bristols adapt," he said. "It is in both halves of the name." She laughed, and it was the laugh she had when something genuinely delighted her, uncalculated and full, and he watched it cross her face and felt the familiar grateful warmth that had not diminished in the time they had been together and showed no signs of diminishing. That autumn and winter were full. The shop was its busiest season, the pre-Christmas trade was brisk, and the new families coming into the surrounding area were buying dry goods and fabric and tools, and the small things that make a new house into a home. Henrietta managed all of it with Dottie's help, and with the additional capacity of a young woman named Agnes who she took on for the busy months, and the shop's ledgers at year's end showed the best year she had run since opening. Bernard spent the autumn preparing the property for the expansion he was planning for the following spring: a new holding pen, an extension to the barn, a better system for the winter water supply that had required more manual labor than it should in their first winter. He worked alongside Theo and Ray with the single-minded satisfaction of a man who is building something real in a place he has decided to belong to. They celebrated Christmas in their own house for the first time that year, with Henry in a state of complete sensory confusion about the tree they had cut from the creekside stand of cottonwoods and the various wrapped items under it. Bernard had carved a set of wooden animals for the boy, a cow, a horse, a dog, with the careful precision of a man who is not naturally artistic, but who is capable of extraordinary patience when the purpose is right. Henrietta had sewn him clothes for the coming year and had also, secretly, framed a small ink drawing she had made of the property from memory, in a moment of quiet that she had grabbed between the shop's busy days, and hung it on the wall of the sitting room while Bernard was outside, so that when he came in from the evening barn check, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the drawing and then at her for a long moment. "You drew that," he said. "I did," she said. "From memory." "That is exactly the shape of it," he said. "The ridge line, that is exactly right." "I have looked at it enough times," she said. He crossed the room and kissed her in the straightforward, entirely sincere way he had, and she held onto his coat in the equally straightforward way she had, and Henry, sitting on the rug with his wooden cow, looked up at his parents with the benign indifference of a 13-month-old who does not yet understand sentiment but is not bothered by it. The second child was a girl, born in May of 1886 on a warm, soft afternoon when the meadowlarks were going at full volume along the fence lines, and the air smelled of new grass and the wildflowers Henrietta had planted along the front walk of the house. She was pink and loud and decided about everything from the first breath, which was both of her parents in one compact, demanding package. They named her Ruth Eliza Bristol, the Eliza for Henrietta's mother, and Ruth for no particular reason except that both of them said it at the same moment when they were considering names, which seemed like the answer. Ruth's arrival made Henry, now 14 months, consider his status in the household with some gravity, but he was an equable child by temperament, and after a period of adjustment, he accepted his sister with the tolerant generosity of someone who has concluded that this new development is not going away and might as well be accommodated. He would bring her his wooden cow periodically and place it near her with a solemnity that made his parents hide their smiles. The years that followed were years of building, the property growing in acreage and in herd, the shop steady and evolving as the town evolved, the family adding its daily increments of living to the sum of what they had made together. Bernard became known in the county as a man who ran a fair and well-managed operation, who paid his people honestly and dealt in good faith with the buyers and the neighboring ranchers, and whose word, once given, was not revised. Henrietta was, as she had always been, the person half of Caldwell relied on for their dry goods, and the other half relied on for the direct advice she gave, without ceremony, on whatever subject came up. She had not stopped being her own person. This was the thing that seemed to surprise some of the older women of Caldwell, who had expected that marriage and children would absorb the independent, self-possessed woman they had watched run a shop alone for 4 years, and would produce in her place something softer and more easily categorized. What it produced instead was a woman who had all of what she had been, and had added to it the particular confidence of someone who is loved by a person who knows them fully and loves them still. She was 35 when Ruth was born, and she counted her age from then on not because anyone required it of her, but because she was genuinely, fully interested in the life she was living, and she wanted to track it. Bernard was 39. He counted too, with the satisfaction of a man for whom the years were accumulating in the right direction at last. They had arguments, because they were both opinionated people with strong preferences about a reasonable number of things. They had days that were too hard and nights that were too cold and springs that were too dry, and cattle that died and crops that failed, and the ordinary grief of ordinary loss. They had, in the spring of 1887, a heartbreak that they did not talk about to anyone outside the two of them, when a pregnancy that they had been carefully hopeful about ended in its early months, and they held each other through the worst of it in the way of two people who have agreed, without words, to be each other's witness for everything, not only the things that deserve celebration. But they had more of the other kind of days. More of the kind where the light came in at the right angle through the kitchen window, and Henry was eating his breakfast with the focused seriousness of a 4-year-old confronting an important task, and Ruth was sitting in her high chair dispatching porridge with 3-year-old authority, and Bernard was at the table with his coffee and the week's newspaper from Wichita, and looked up from it, and met Henrietta's eyes across the kitchen with no particular expression. Just the meeting of eyes between two people who know they are in the right place, and she looked back with the same knowledge, and there was nothing more that needed to be said. In the spring of 1888, the Grayson sign above the shop came down for 2 days while the building was repainted, and when it went back up it read Grayson Bristol Dry Goods and Millinery, which was Henrietta's decision, and which she had made without consulting anyone, because it was her shop and her name and her husband's name, and she liked the sound of them together in the place where she had built something that had lasted. Bernard came to town the day the new sign went up and stood across the street and looked at it for a long time. He came into the shop and Henrietta was behind the counter, watching him with the slight assessment in her expression that meant she was waiting for his response and was prepared for any reasonable version of it. "You put my name on your sign," he said. "I put both our names on my sign," she said. "This is mine. I built it. Your name is there because I chose to put it there." "I understand that," he said. "Good," she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that it is one of the finest things anyone has done for me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go buy something," she said. "You are making a scene." "There is no one else in the shop," he said. "There will be," she said. "This is Caldwell." He bought a tin of coffee he did not need and went back to the property, and the new sign caught the afternoon light above the doorway of Grayson Bristol Dry Goods and Millinery, and it looked, to anyone who cared to notice, exactly right. Henry Grayson Bristol grew into a boy of considerable intelligence, and a will that required careful direction rather than repression, and his parents approached the directing of it with the combined competence of two people who understood the difference. He helped his father with the cattle on weekends and holidays with the seriousness of a small person who intends to be useful, and he helped his mother in the shop on the mornings. She brought him in with the seriousness of a small person who intends to learn everything about everything, And between these two educations, he was growing into someone who knew how the world worked from the inside rather than from books alone, though the books were also present. Because Henrietta Grayson Bristol's children grew up in a house where reading was as ordinary as eating. Ruth was a different kind of person, entirely louder, faster, more immediately and physically engaged with the world. A child who climbed everything available and had opinions about everything audible, and who had decided by age 4 that horses were the most important thing in existence, and organized her entire reality around this conclusion. Bernard started teaching her to ride at an age that made Henrietta raise her eyebrows and then concede, when she saw the child on horseback, that Ruth had been correct about herself. In the summer of 1889, Kansas achieved statehood in its own continued evolution as the territory borders were drawn and redrawn, and the Indian Territory below them continued to be subjected to the pressures and injustices that Bernard and Henrietta had both, in their separate and then shared lives, watched with the uneasy awareness of people who understand that the land they are farming was not empty before they arrived, and that the history of how it became available to them was not a clean or uncomplicated history. Bernard had encountered this directly during his cattle drive years, when the Kishom Trail had passed through the territory, and had come away with a respect for the people of the nations, and a discomfort with the easy justifications that most people in his position offered themselves. They were not people who could change the large directions of history. They were people who could be honest about it, and they were, in the way that they talked to their children about the land and its history, and the people who had lived on it before them, and in the way they dealt fairly with the occasional workers who came from across the territory border, and in the consistency of their belief that a fair wage and honest dealing were not optional luxuries, but basic requirements of a person who wanted to live with themselves in the long run. The years continued their accumulation. The cattle operation at Bristol Creek was, by 1890, a solid and respected enterprise, not the largest in the county, but among the most reliably profitable and certainly the most scrupulously managed. Bernard had, over the years, developed a reputation for the kind of steady, honest dealing that makes a man's handshake worth more than most people's written contracts, and this reputation had its practical value as well as its ethical one. Henrietta's shop continued to anchor the south side of the main avenue, and by 1890 it had expanded into the building next door, the telegraph office having moved to larger premises, giving her more floor space for the dry goods and a separate room at the back for the millinery work, which had grown in the years since she had started. She hired a proper milliner, a woman from Kansas City named Vera Cho, who had come west with her husband when he took a government surveying job and who turned out to have extraordinary hands for the work. Between Henrietta's business sense, Dottie Pierce's long-established competence, and Vera's craft, the expanded shop was the most complete and well-run establishment of its kind in the county. She was 40 years old in 1890, and she was more fully herself than she had ever been, which is the kind of thing that sounds like a platitude until you see it in a person who has actually arrived at that condition. She was not without difficulties. Life does not operate on a system of earned comfort where the hard years pay for the easy ones, but she was a person who had built what she intended to build and was living in it fully. Bernard was 44. He was gray at his temples, and the weathering of his face had deepened, and he was, in Henrietta's considered view, considerably better looking than he had been at 37. In the way that some men become more themselves as they age, the features settling into a coherence that youth's uncertainty had worked against. He had never become a man who expressed himself easily in words, but he had learned, over the years of their marriage, to express himself in the consistent, present, attentive ways that meant more than eloquence to a woman who had watched him build a life with those qualities for over 6 years. He was at the table in the mornings and at the table in the evenings, and when he was not at the table, He was somewhere on the property or in the shop, and he was reachable, findable. There. Not because he was required to be, but because there was nowhere he would rather be, and both of them knew it. In the autumn of 1890, they sat on the porch of the Bristol Creek house in the cool evening after Henry and Ruth had gone to bed, watching the stars appear one by one over the dark line of the ridge, and Henrietta said, without any particular preface, "Do you remember what you told me, that first evening in the back room of the shop? About being more interested in me than you had been in anyone in a long time." "I remember," he said. "I thought about it for a week before I answered it properly," she said. "I was deciding whether you meant it or whether you were saying what a man says when he wants a woman to say yes." "What decided you?" he asked. "The fact that you had come back to the shop 4 times before you said it," she said. "A man who just wants a yes does not do that much groundwork." He was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," he said, which surprised her because he did not use that word about himself. "You were," she said. "I had not said something like that to a person in a very long time," he said. "I was not sure I was still capable of it, and then there was the question of whether you would think I was worth saying yes to, which I was not entirely certain of myself." She looked at him in the dark. "Bernard." "I know," he said. "7 years ago I would not have been, probably. I was closed over in ways I did not entirely understand." "You are not closed now," she said. "No," he said. "I am not. You opened the window." She took his hand, and he held it, and they sat in the dark on the porch of the house they had made together, and listened to the night sounds of the property. The cattle settling, the creek in the east, the occasional call of something nocturnal in the grass. And it was quiet and complete and entirely, exactly the life that both of them had at 33 and 37, stopped counting the years of expecting and had finally, fully found. The following spring, 1891, brought one more child, a boy they named James, for the old widower who had let Bernard use his stove in those early lonely months in Caldwell, because Bernard was a person who remembered the kindnesses that had been offered to him in difficult times and believed in honoring them. James came into the world on an April morning very much like the one that had brought Henry, and he was small and quiet and entirely himself from the first, with dark eyes that looked at things for a long time before coming to conclusions, and both parents recognized this quality and were glad. Henry was 6 by this point, and Ruth was nearly 5, and they received their new brother with the mixed reviews appropriate to siblings of their respective ages and temperaments. Henry was solemn and considered about it. Ruth declared him acceptable but small, and indicated that she would be willing to reconsider when he was larger. They both came around entirely within the week, as children do, and James grew up with a brother who taught him to observe things carefully and a sister who taught him to climb fences. The shop sign still read Grayson Bristol Dry Goods and Millinery in the spring of 1891, and it would read that for many years to come, because both halves of the name had proven themselves worth keeping. The Bristol Creek property ran its cattle across 520 acres by then, having added the additional 200 through a purchase from the neighboring farm whose owner had decided to retire to his daughter's house in Wichita. The house had been added onto twice, and was now genuinely comfortable in all seasons, with a good kitchen and a sitting room with shelves for the books that had accumulated over the years of their marriage. The Whitman and the novels and the histories and the children's books and the agricultural manuals, and the volumes of poetry that Henrietta read in the evenings and occasionally read aloud to Bernard, who listened with his eyes closed, and the look of a man who is both resting and paying close attention. Theo Aldridge had, by 1891, been working at Bristol Creek for 8 years, and had the status of a trusted man, rather than an employee in the ordinary sense. Ray Delacroix had retired the previous year at an age he declined to specify, and had gone to live with his nephew in Dodge City, sending Bernard a brief and characteristically unsentimental note to mark the occasion. Dottie Pierce had married a farmer from the North County in 1888, and still worked at the shop 3 mornings a week. And Vera Cho was still making hats with extraordinary precision and had become, along the way, one of Henrietta's closest friends. They were, in the census that was taken in 1890, simply a family of 5 on a property of significant acreage east of Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 occupational listings, rancher and merchant, which captured the practical shape of what they had built without capturing anything essential about how they had built it, or what it had cost them to arrive here, or what it meant to have arrived. What it meant was this: 2 people who had stopped counting the years the world expected certain things of them had, in the stopping, made room for something real. Not perfect and not without cost, and not without the ordinary grief of ordinary living, but real and theirs and growing. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, April of 1891, Bernard came in from the property in the late afternoon and found Henrietta in the sitting room with James asleep in her lap, and the Whitman open on the arm of the chair, and the particular look on her face that she had when she had been reading something that had reached her. Henry and Ruth were somewhere outside performing one of their endlessly inventive games that seemed to involve the barn, several lengths of rope, and a level of creative energy that Bernard had long since stopped attempting to track. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, the way he had looked at the property on that first autumn day of walking it, with recognition and with the particular gratitude of someone who understands that what they are looking at is worth more than they had known how to ask for. She looked up and saw him and said, with the directness she had applied to everything since the first morning she had turned from her ledger to tell him she carried rope and coffee and boot oil, 7 years. 7 years, he confirmed. We have done all right, she said. We have done considerably better than all right, he said. Yes, she said, and closed the book. We have. James stirred in her lap and made the particular small sound that meant he was about to wake, and from outside the sounds of Henry and Ruth, and whatever they were constructing rose briefly and then settled, and the house was warm with the April evening light coming through the windows and the particular completeness of a place that is full of the people who belong in it. Bernard crossed the room and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder with the ease of 2 people who have been doing this long enough that it is both a habit and a choice, and the weight of 7 years, and the weight of everything before the 7 years, the losses and the starting overs, the careful negotiations with hope, the mornings they had each, separately, stopped counting what they were supposed to have by now sat lightly, because what they had found when they stopped counting had been, in the end, more than enough. It had been, in the language that both of them would have used if either of them had been the kind of person to make speeches, which they were not, exactly right. The creek ran east of the property. The cattle grazed in the afternoon light. The children's voices came and went on the spring air. The shop sign bore both their names on the South Avenue of Caldwell. The house was full and warm and built to last, and the 2 people in it 33 and stopped counting when they found each other, 37 and done counting too, had made, out of everything they had brought and everything they had lost, and the quiet Tuesday morning when a man walked into a woman's shop and asked for rope and coffee, a life that was entirely and completely theirs.